Lastly, we're going to be looking at the different energy systems and their responses during exercise. Firstly, we're going to talk about the structure of ATP as a molecule. So adenosine triphosphate is the biological chemical molecule that is responsible for providing the energy needed for biological reactions in the respiring tissues like the muscles, so it allows them to perform contractions. There are high energy bonds between the adenosine protein and the 3-phosphates which is attached to it. So it requires an enzyme to break these bonds to release the energy needed for contraction. The enzyme responsible for this is ATPase, which causes a phosphate to break away from the ATP, so it now becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So one phosphate is left over from the hydrolysis reaction. This breakdown of ATP allows the energy to be released, enabling the myosin to pull on the actin filaments by a power stroke motion to allow the muscle to shorten by pulling the actin filaments inwards to result in the contraction of the muscle and to release the energy. When the cross bridge is broken due to the ATP molecule binding the head of the myosin detaches from the actin. So it relates to the sliding filament theory and how that allows the muscle to contract by shortening. Within the muscles, particularly skeletal ones, there is not an endless supply of ATP, and there's roughly around 80 to 100 grams that is stored. So this is why it's depleted very quickly, and so in order to keep the muscles to contracting, we have to resynthesize the ATP in order to supply the respiring tissues with energy. This is why during exercise there is an instant increased demand for energy. Because it is only stored for a maximum of 3 seconds, it requires one of the 3 energy systems to resynthesize it, so it can produce energy at a faster rate or last for a longer duration. In order to initiate a muscular contraction, ATP must be present even when it's been depleted by our sports that we participate in. So it has to be replenished so further muscular contractions can be initiated. This is why it's important in maximal sports such as shot put, because in the first exertion phase the athletes become fatigued very quickly because they're using all their energy, so the ATP depletes at an increased rate. So in order to allow the athlete to prepare themselves for their next attempt, they must use an energy system that works at a lower intensity for a longer duration. The energy systems are vital in order to allow our bodies with energy in order to carry out our biological functions. The body requires energy mainly from food that is digested from carbohydrates, proteins and fats that get broken down into more simpler molecules such as glucose, fatty acids and amino acids, which are absorbed into the bloodstream and directed to different required body cells. From this, they can be used to generate ATP as a fuel source. Within the body, there are 3 different types of systems that supply the cells with ATP to meet their demands. During different activities and their phases in our sports, we each use the 3 different systems intertwined, and when one is more dominant, there can be parts when they all work together to give a constant supply of energy to respiring tissues like the muscles. They differ in the rate in which they make ATP and how much they make. So for aerobic sports or exercise, we don't need to produce ATP at the same rate we would for maximal sports, and we would therefore use a different system to support that type of exercise. The first system we're going to talk about is the phosphocreatine system. This is the system that is responsible for supplying ATP at the fastest rate, but without oxygen, hence why it is an anaerobic system. The phosphocreatine system uses phosphocreatine as the source in order to resynthesize the ATP. It is composed of a phosphate and a molecule of creatine which is stored in the muscle sarcoplasm and liver, which is why it makes it immediately available, so it is less complex and a faster way to process than the other energy systems. Therefore, it is good for maximal activities because it produces a small amount of ATP in a quick duration without producing the waste products like lactic acid, which would cause the performer to have to reduce their performance. But however, there is only enough phosphocreatine in the muscles to resynthesize ATP for around 8 to 10 seconds before becoming depleted. So therefore it will cause the performer to fatigue, so they will not be able to maintain their speed or performance in their sport. So one of the main disadvantages of this system is that for an athlete to fully recover, it takes the body around 2 to 3 minutes. So in a variety of sporting situations, to recover the PC stores, there is an insufficient recovery time. This is why the athlete would then have to rely on another energy system to resynthesize the PC stores, and this would be the aerobic system. An example of where the ATP-PC system is vital is in the 100 meters, because it is an anaerobic event that requires the athlete to work at their maximum intensity for a short duration. It helps the athlete by providing the energy in the muscles to allow them to explode out of the starting blocks and perform during the whole race. Particularly the fast glycolytic muscle fibers will be generating the fast contraction due to the rate at which ATP is broken down. So this diagram just shows the idea of phosphocreatine being broken down and being used in muscular contraction. So we have the adenosine molecule, which is joined to the two phosphates, which have the high energy bonds between them. So obviously this requires an enzyme, and in this case it's creatine kinase, which is used to break the PC bond and join the phosphate to the ATP. From this process we gain one ATP molecule, so it's very limited in its duration and how much we produce. The next energy system is the anaerobic glycolysis system. This is also an anaerobic system like the ATP-PC system. So oxygen is not required to fuel this energy, and instead carbohydrates are the main source that supply the glucose in the body. So it can be stored as glycogen in the muscles and then broken down to create ATP. This is the reason why it is important for maximum activities that are of a short duration. For example, a 400-meter race of an uphill climb in a cycle race. Because they are short but happening at a very high intensity. The process starts at the muscles where the glycogen in the muscles is broken down into glucose by the enzyme GPP, glycogen phosphorylase. This requires two ATP molecules to supply the energy for this hydrolysis reaction, which then converts it into pyruvic acid by the enzyme PVK, which releases energy. If oxygen is present, then aerobic respiration takes place, but if there is no oxygen, then lactate dehydrogenase breaks down the pyruvate into lactic acid. This in turn increases acidity, which forces the athlete to slow down the muscle contraction and revert back to using the aerobic system, as it inhibits enzymes breaking down the products. The byproduct of producing lactic acid is the H+ ions, which mainly cause the fatigue and pain within the muscles and forces the athlete to slow down. Because if the athlete tried to contribute at the same speed for the duration, the acidity would increase. So this is why the anaerobic glycolysis system has a duration of around 2 to 3 minutes before needing time to recover. This is why the recovery time to remove the lactic acid is a main disadvantage, as it takes around 8 minutes to remove it and replace the glycogen stores. This system produces 4 ATP molecules, which gives a net gain of 2 molecules. So we gain more ATP than we did in the ATP-PC system, but it's still quite a limited supply. So athletes that are working within 80 to 90% of their maximum heart rate will start to accumulate lactic acid, causing the ATP to deplenish. So in events like the 400 meters, they will begin to show signs that they are fatiguing around 350 meters. Due to long-term adaptations from training, the athletes should be able to power through by maintaining their speed or even generating enough power to speed up as they sprint for the line. This is down to the training methods used, which can actually help an individual use lactic acid to their advantage and use it to provide energy rather than to fatigue. Here we have a graph which shows the different energy systems being dominant and the duration that they can progress for throughout the exercise. As previously mentioned, there are three factors which determine the dominant system: the intensity, the duration, and one of the most important is the fitness level of the athlete in terms of their anaerobic and aerobic fitness, which determines their dominant system. For example, if we take a marathon runner, they would have a higher aerobic fitness than someone of a sprinter or a maximal athlete, and so they would take longer to reach the anaerobic threshold, which causes them to stop receiving energy from the aerobic systems, compared to a performer who has a greater anaerobic fitness that can sustain longer performance in the anaerobic zone, which they can last for up to 2 minutes, due to these adaptations that have allowed them to tolerate the lactic acid levels. We also have a picture here showing the energy continuum and how the interplay between different energy systems within the sports. So we can see, as an example, we've got that marathon running uses 100% aerobic, the system as the dominant system. But then we can also see that some of the team sports as well are using both the systems in the different phases, so there is interplay between the systems. And these are some of the sports that I've mentioned: the ATP-PC system using the 100-metre sprint, and the anaerobic glycolysis system using the 400 metres as an example. So in terms of the investigation data from the fitness test that we have gathered, in the multi-stage fitness test, there is significant interplay between the energy systems during the first 3 seconds of the test. The ATP in the muscles is fueling the exercise, but because it only lasts for 3 seconds, it needs to be resynthesized. It then relies on the phosphocreatine system in order to stick the bonds back together to provide the energy for around 7 seconds that would have helped the participant to complete the distance there and provide the energy to allow them to get back before the bleep. But this system is then depleted, so it requires the glycolytic system in order to supply the energy needed for the performer to maintain performance. So during the middle of the phase of the multi-stage fitness test, there is a lower intensity and the performer is using their aerobic system to maintain performance. But as soon as the intensity is increased, we are then forced to use the glycolytic system, which causes a build-up of lactic acid and H+ ions, causing us to stop or reduce our performance. We can see from the blood lactate graph that during the low intensity, there is little change in blood lactate levels and it doesn't build up, but as the incrementals increased during the test and the performer was working anaerobically, it built up at rapid increase. And this is similar during the Wingate. We had low levels of blood lactate at rest, but when we took the blood lactate levels after the test, we saw a rapid increase. And again, it's due to the interplay between the different systems and the changing of intensity of the Wingate test from going from no resistance to having some resistance on the bike. It showed that the blood lactate increased. We also here have a typical graph showing the speed and how that affects the blood lactate levels of a performer. So in terms of blood lactate, we have a point called OBLA, which is where blood lactate accumulation becomes extensive enough to suppress performance. It depends on the level of training of the athlete and lies between 2 and 4 millimoles, 4 millimoles being the average. The lactic acid increases and lowers the pH, which in turn inhibits enzyme activity in glycolysis. So this prevents the breakdown of glucose, inducing fatigue. And this is why the athlete is forced to stop. So an athlete that has better fitness would be able to sustain their speed for a longer period of time, so they could keep working for a longer duration at the higher intensity. So someone who was less fit would fatigue earlier.